Hey guys, thanks for downloading the model essay pack from the 2021 10-year series. I hope you found it tremendously useful. If you're looking for more essays, right, to help you along with your revision and all that, do check out Popular. I actually have a full book of model essays over there. 50 questions, one from every, covering all chapters, not just one, right? There are 50 essays across all the chapters, and they're arranged in increasing difficulty with a lot of guided notes to help you figure out how to do the essays and not just give you the model answers and expect you to figure it out yourself. So be sure to check out the book if you're still looking for like more full essays that you can refer to. Now, we ran a poll and most of you voted for me to do question four of the 10-day series. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to be taking you through question four with a key focus on how exactly do you figure out what the answer is, right? Just by looking at the question, right? When it comes to essays, it's not just about trying to memorize the model answers, but it's really about, looking at a question and knowing how you formulate the structure. So in this short session today, I hope to give you the skills that you need, right, to dissect the question, to figure out what the scope of the answer is, and hopefully that will help you to do whatever future essays that you might come across. Okay, so here's question four, right? And it basically tells us that the rate of unemployment in more than 50 of the world's countries, including several European countries, exceeds 10%. Governments face a difficult decision about whether income tax cuts are the most effective policies to reduce unemployment to more acceptable levels. So that's the preamble. And normally what the preamble does is that, it gives us context. It kind of tells you, what you should be including, right, as examples in your essays. It gives you the background information that you should use to help you, answer the question. And more frequently, we see the preamble being important for part B than for part A. But you just want to keep a close eye on the preamble. You don't want to ignore it. You want to incorporate whatever information is available in there, just to make sure that you're being contextually relevant. You're actually answering the question. So let's talk about part A first, right? Part A asks, how does the reduction in the rate of income taxes paid by workers and firms might have consequences on the economy's aggregate demand and aggregate supply? Now, the first thing I want to say is this is what I categorize in my classes as an impact question, right? So why do I call it an impact question? It's an impact question because of two things. Number one, they give you a trigger, right? This is what I like to refer to as a trigger. So the trigger is the thing that triggers the change, triggers the impact in the economy. The second, clue in the question is they're asking you for consequences on the economy, right? And they're quite kind. They explicitly said, tell us what happens to AD and AS. So in an impact question, right, basically we're trying to figure out what's happening in an economy based on some piece of information that's being provided to us. I say this question is kind because a lot of impact questions actually don't explicitly specify that you should talk about AD and AS impacts. And that tends to throw a lot of people off. And you end up answering the question in a way that doesn't use enough macroeconomic rigor. So this question is quite kind because they explicitly told you AD and AS, right? Okay, so the thought process goes as such. What you want to ask yourself is, what are the factors of ADAS that you have learned that will be related to the trigger that's provided to you? So your thought process would be, okay, how does AD change? How does SRAS change, if any? How does LRAS change, if any? Right? So it's not necessarily that all three of these things have to change, right? But you should be thinking about, okay, what could it possibly be? Now, if the question goes aggregate demand and aggregate supply, they're helping you a lot here because they're telling you that AD will definitely change and AS will definitely change as well. The only question is you don't really know which of the two ASs you're supposed to talk about. Now, as far as AD goes, this should be very, very simple because you should recognize that income tax paid by workers is going to affect consumption. It's a consumption factor. You're supposed to realize that income tax paid by firms, I agree that the phrasing could be a bit tricky, but what they really mean when they say income tax paid by firms is they mean corporate taxes, right? That's what you learn. So if you cut corporate taxes, investments will increase, and so AD would rise, right? So that's the first conclusion you have to draw, right? You have to realize that, okay, aggregate demand is supposed to increase. Okay, what then, right? What comes next? How do we turn this into a proper essay? Now, let me take a step back first, right? When it comes to 10-mark questions, right, let me give you some guidelines. The first thing to keep in mind is that your 10-mark question is supposed to come up to about a page and a half to 2 pages, right? Okay, so that's the first thing to keep in mind, right? You need to have an awareness that if your essay comes up too short, then obviously it's not going to be a good essay, right? So there is a certain required length, right? It has to be about 1.5 to 2 pages on exam full skep, right? Which is double margin. It's arguably shorter than if you use like popular full skep, which is only single margin. So 1.5 to 2 pages on exam full skep, right? That's the length that you're shooting for. Okay. Now, what about the details, right? So what goes into the 1.5 to 2 pages? So we like to say that you're normally striving for 1 to 2 diagrams and 2 to 3 major points. Okay. Now, this is to do 2 things. Number 1 is to tell you that, okay, diagrams are important, right? Especially in Part A essays. Part A essays are fundamentally about depth, right? It's about details. Because as you just saw for yourself, as far as what happens to AD is concerned, it's almost like a single line answer, right? It's like AD rises, right? But that's not enough. We can't just say that. We have to provide details. And what better way to provide details than to have a diagram? So the fact that I say 1 to 2 diagrams is to remind you that, hey, diagrams are really important. If they are relevant to the topic you're talking about, they should be in the essay. Okay? Now, some of you might be like, what if I don't have a diagram, right? What are some essays that might not have diagrams? So obviously there are some pockets in the syllabus that don't have diagrams. Like for example, if you're doing a public good question, there is no diagram for that. If you're doing a question on key economic indicators, right, about GDP and GNI, of course there's no diagrams for that, right? So we're saying prioritize diagrams, but it's not always going to be the case that you will always have a diagram. It really depends on the topic you're talking about. But given that it's ADAS, I think it should be infinitely clear that a diagram is rather relevant to you. Now, the idea of 2 to 3 major points is to point out to you that you need to have 2 to 3 distinct things that you want to talk about, right? So when I say 2 to 3 major points, I mean that you could actually have sub-points. You could have sub-details. But the idea of a major point is telling you that you cannot just be writing 2 or 3 sentences, right? You need to have one block of information, right, to demonstrate rigor. So how do we take this and translate it into the section to talk about AD? Well, very simple. We're going to need 3 things in total. So obviously, we're going to need the diagram, right? Now, prior to the diagram, you're going to have to explain the factors. So you're going to have to explain how these things work in detail. Now, the good news is, if you know your policies well, you should realize that this is part of expansionary fiscal policy. So in expansionary fiscal policy, you would have learned a very detailed explanation about how to explain income tax changes and corporate tax changes. So you're supposed to borrow from fiscal policy, use the mechanism that you learned there, right, and plug the explanation in here. So after you explain the factors, you tell me that AD is supposed to rise, you draw the diagram, and finally, please explain the diagram, right? Have the mechanism to explain the diagram. Okay, you need to explain the process of what's happening to AD. How do you get to a new equilibrium? So although I have like point 1 and point 3 here, I regard this as one major point because this entire section is solely talking about aggregate demand, but we have 2 sub-points. We explain the factors, we explain the mechanism of the diagram. So this also goes back to how you're supposed to study your content, right? I always tell my students in class that econs essays should be done with a building blocks approach. And what that means is that when you study, right, you have to remember the information that you're learning in blocks and be prepared to regurgitate those blocks of information into the essay. So what you're going to realize, especially if you pick up my book, right, you're going to realize that across different essays, you tend to see things repeating themselves. Every time I talk about fiscal policy, you're going to see the same explanation. Every time I talk about a shift in AD, you're going to see the same explanation. So if you're struggling with essays because every time you pick up an essay question and you're like, I don't know what to say, I don't know how to explain, then you're really studying the subject wrong, right? Your job is not to, every time you write an essay, you think line by line, oh, what do I say here? What do I say there? That's never going to work. You have no time, right? It's a mad rush in the econs paper. You have no time to think sentence by sentence. So you need to have this pre-memorized chunks of information that you can always dump into the essay to help you address the question. Okay, so that settles the AD part. Now, what about AS? Now, this is arguably the harder part of the question because a lot of you are going to look at this and go, hey, but I learned that these things only affect AD, what, right? They are AD factors. How can AS change? Now, if you're thinking like that, then you're really shooting yourself in the foot because the question already told you AS must change. So the thing to ask yourself is, okay, if AS must change, how exactly is it supposed to change? And that goes back to factors, right? For SRAS, we understand that SRAS is affected by cost of production, right? So SRAS factors will be things like wage cost, raw material costs, and so on. And you want to ask yourself, right, do income taxes paid by workers and firms affect cost of production? Now, let me tell you what the mistake is. A lot of people will go, oh, when firms pay more income tax, their cost of production rises. That is incorrect. The only kind of tax that affects cost of production are indirect taxes. Things like GST, that will affect cost of production. So income tax for firms, corporate taxes, do not affect cost of production. So SRAS is out. So it's supposed to affect LRAS. So how does changing income taxes and corporate taxes affect LRAS? How does it lead to your LRAS rising? Okay, so let me tell you how it works first. When you lower income taxes, it could increase the incentive to work, which in turn could increase the size of the labor force, which represents an increase in quantity of FOP, and that is supposed to raise LRAS. Right? Remember that LRAS is affected by three things: QQT, quantity of resources, quality of resources, technological advancement. So this is quantity of FOP. What about corporate taxes? Well, when firms increase investments, it actually increases the quantity of capital in the economy. There are more capital goods, right? There are more machines, there are more factories and whatnot. And again, it raises LRAS via an increase in quantity of FOP. Now, you might be wondering, like, how in the world do you know this, right? So this is actually the tricky part of the question because it's not obvious where this piece of information comes from. So the answer is this is actually learned under market-oriented supply-side policies. So if you haven't gotten that far, right, in school, you haven't gotten to supply-side policies yet, then maybe you can't quite see the angle. Now, some of you, when you're learning fiscal policy, they actually taught you that these things could have supply-side impacts, right? They told you that these things could have supply-side impact. So you might have encountered this when you were studying fiscal policy because we know that income and corporate tax cuts are primarily part of fiscal policy. So for those of you that are only doing fiscal policy in school and your school notes is designed like that, then yeah, sure, you might actually have seen this theory, right, being mentioned. But so for now, if you can't get this, right, it's not the end of the world, right? It's fine. It's just something you have to keep an eye out on. I'm more concerned at this juncture as to whether you could come up with the structure, right, to realize that, okay, I need to talk about AD, I need to talk about LRAS. And once you can figure this out, then you're just going to duplicate these 3 steps for LRAS. You're going to have to explain the factor, right? That means you're going to have to elaborate on the green box that I gave you. You're going to have to pop in a diagram showing an increase in LRAS, and then finally, you should explain the diagram as well, show the mechanism. So what you will realize is that the model essay for this is just split very nicely into 2 parts. The first part talks about AD, the second part talks about LRAS. So that is to say, I'm essentially telling you that this question, this part A, has 2 diagrams and 2 major points. That's the way to think about it. So this also tells you that you should never write an essay in a scattergun approach. If you're writing essays based on like, oh, I'll just put in whatever I can think of, you're never going to get an A. You will barely even get a B. You're always going to be floundering because it's basically a spray and pray strategy, right? You're just hoping that whatever you put in is going to be relevant. There is no deliberation you are not being strategic about your answer, there's no attention paid to structure. You will never get the score. So econs essays are very brutal because there's a fixed set of things that they're looking for, and there's a fixed set of language that they expect you to convey. So we always talk about the importance of structure and content, right? So in my classes, like what I'm doing with you right now, I can teach you the structure. I teach you how to think. I teach you what the essay needs. So I'm basically trying to tell you that if you don't have these 6 things, you are never going to get an A. You can forget about it. You will never get an A, no matter how good your answer is, if you don't check off these 6 boxes. Now, once you have learned the structure and you're consistently able to deliver on the structure, the last thing you need to be good at doing is you've got to be good at delivering on the structure, giving a good exam grade explanation. And that is where the marking comes in. That's where the model essay helps you, right? To help you visualize how to put your sentences together. But more critically, there's a memorization element to it. You got to memorize the keywords, you got to understand the logic, and you got to practice putting those things into sentences yourself. Okay? So this is part A. So this is honestly a fairly easy part A question. Okay, a fairly easy part A question. I would say the LRAS part's a bit tricky, but it's not difficult, by any stretch of imagination. If you're struggling because you don't understand the mechanism here, because you haven't done supply side policy, that's totally fine. I mean, you will get it eventually, right? Because that's just a knowledge gap that you haven't filled right now. Okay, so that's part A. Let's talk about part B. So I just copied the preamble here for you, and then I popped in part B there. So part B asks, discuss whether a reduction in the rate of income taxes is likely to be the best policy to reduce high unemployment in the country. Now, this is what we call, so just now the question I said, that's an impact question, right? This is what I call a policy question. So the last thing you do in macro is going to be macro policies. I believe most of you should have started at least on fiscal. If not, you are probably onto monetary, maybe going into exchange rates. I think most of you probably haven't done supply side policy yet. But anyway, this is a policy question. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is that policy questions in macro are actually tremendously similar to policy questions in market failure. They are tremendously similar to market failure policy questions. So you can use that as a guidepost. So what did we learn in market failure? Right? If you were struggling with market failure, then it might be useful to hear this also. So with market failure policy questions, the rule is you always need 2 to 3 policies. It's never just one policy, simply by virtue of the fact that it's not going to be long enough. Because a 15-mark question needs to be 3+ pages, pushing towards 4 pages, right? I'm talking about 4 sides, not 4 sheets of paper. 4 sheets of paper will be 8. That's a bit much. So market failure questions, 2 to 3 policies, and you always have to discuss their pros and cons. For the pro, you always have to talk about the mechanism. You have to talk about how the policy benefits the problem. The cons are just simply the limitation. And then at the end, you have an evaluation. So what I'm saying to you here is that similarly, in a macro policy question, it is necessary to have more than one policy. That is to say, you cannot just talk about this. If the whole essay, you only talk about this, you're going to be in trouble. You will most certainly fail. Okay? So, 2 to 3 policies, pros and cons. So let's step by step, right? I mentioned that a reduction in income taxes, pay attention, because based on part A, we know that they really mean both income and corporate tax, okay? So you're supposed to cover both, okay? You're supposed to cover both. So read carefully. Like I said, I understand that they are not being very kind here by calling it income taxes paid by firms, okay? We normally call it corporate taxes, but it is what it is, right? They already told you in part A. So that carries over to part B as well. So I mentioned to you in part A that this is part of fiscal policy, right? So part of fiscal policy. So the first thing you got to keep in mind is, okay, we're going to do fiscal policy, pros and cons. Okay? Now the good news is, as far as the mechanism for raising AD goes, you just need to rehash. You know why you need to rehash? Because you already explained this in full in part A. So you don't have to repeat it, right? You just have to rehash it. You don't even need to draw a fresh diagram for it. But the key thing is you need to link to unemployment, right? So it's like you already did the hard work in part A. You just have to rehash it, right? So you say something like, with reference to part A, we explained that cutting income taxes and all that will raise AD and will raise real GDP. And then you have to link it to unemployment. Now, what you have to realize is that this reduces cyclical unemployment. Okay? This reduces cyclical unemployment. Because when you raise AD and you raise real GDP, with more goods and services being produced, there's going to be a rise in demand for labor because firms need more workers to produce goods and services. Okay? Cool. So this is what you're going to put into this box, right? We talk about the pros of fiscal policy, basically how it works, and how it reduces unemployment. The whole idea of cyclical unemployment, rise in demand for labor, those are key phrases. Those are really, really, really important. Okay, limitations of fiscal policy, very simple, right? The three major ones that we always talk about is size of multiplier, right? Size of multiplier, size of K. And then we have crowding out. And then we have time lag, right? These are like the three most important limitations of fiscal policy. The rest are like a bit smaller limitations. So again, you can never run away from the memory work, right? That is to say, if I tell you that every time you do a policy question, you need pros and cons, right? And you need limitations, and you gotta memorize them, right? You gotta be at any time able to say, okay, fiscal policy has this few limitations. You cannot make stuff up. You must regurgitate, right? You must take the explanation that you learn in theory and then dump it in here. Okay, so that's the fiscal policy one. Then what else do you need? To figure out what else you need, you need to take a step back and you need to analyze this. Okay, so this is a key thing to pay attention to in macro policy questions that we don't worry so much in market failure. What you got to remember is that every one of these macro goals and macro problems have multiple underlying causes. When you learn economic growth, we teach you actual and potential. When you do inflation, there's demand pull and cost push. When it comes to unemployment, you have cyclical, you have structural, you have frictional. So what you got to realize is that fiscal policy primarily helps you to fix this, but it isn't really so good at fixing structural unemployment in particular. Okay? So the thing is, I say you need more than one policy, right? Your alternative policies has to be to solve the other problems, right? So the question, again, if you're doing these things for the first time, the questions are very evil because you look at them, they never even say you need supply side policy, but they expect you to figure it out on your own. They expect you to realize that what policy to use to deal with unemployment is highly contingent on what problem you are facing. They didn't say what type of unemployment. So you got to realize that, if you are cyclical, fiscal policy is okay. But if you're structural unemployment, you got no choice, but you have to use supply side policies. Specifically, you need to use education and training, right, to reduce structural unemployment. Because what's structural unemployment about? Structural unemployment is about the mismatch of skills. So you want to reduce the mismatch of skills, right, between workers and employers by giving workers relevant skills. You give them training, you give them education, you help them to get the relevant skills, and help them move into a different industry. So this part, right, is like completely based on theory. It's completely regurgitation. Like there's nothing special here, right? It's just taking what you know from supply side policy, combining it with what you know for structural unemployment. That's basically it. The hard part is realizing that you need this in the first place. So you need to understand the logic. You need supply side policies because fiscal cannot deal with structural. Okay? Limitations of supply side policies. Again, there are three. So I like to say indeterminate outcomes, and then you have time lag, and then you have burden on government budget. Okay? So the idea behind indeterminate outcomes is simply the fact that some of these supply side policies might not work. You might want to train workers to give them skills, but whether they succeed or not depends on their own abilities and also their openness to receiving training and education. So there's no guarantee that you can actually help workers get out of structural unemployment if they don't actually have the ability to learn new skills, or they are not even willing to go and learn new skills. Time lag is a problem for supply side policy because, first of all, you suffer from the same kind of bureaucracy that plagues fiscal policy. The whole reason why fiscal policy has a time lag is because you need to go through parliament, right? The government works on a parliamentary system. In most democracies, right, you have to vote on policies. So the thing is that could take weeks, if not months, right, to actually pass through parliament, to actually get enough votes to carry out the policy that you want to. So supply side policy is faced with the same issue, right? You need to go through parliament and get parliamentary approval. But not only that, right? There is the inherent long duration associated with supply side policy. So if we talk about education and training, you can't give workers new skills in just a matter of days or weeks. Training has to go on for months, if not years. So not only do you need a long time for approval, you also need to wait for the policy to take effect. And so supply side policy is subjected to quite significant time lag. And the last thing is it imposes a burden on the government budget because spending on education and training requires the government to spend money, right? And so it basically creates an opportunity cost because if the government is going to spend on education and training, then they might have to give up spending on other areas. Okay, so fiscal, supply side. Now the last thing is actually reducing income tax. Okay, this is what a lot of people don't actually know, right? Reducing income tax could actually reduce frictional unemployment. Now, the fundamental problem behind frictional unemployment is about imperfect information, right? It's about the fact that people take time to actually look for jobs, right? People take time to actually look for jobs, right? Like you want a job today, you don't know of all the jobs available, you don't know if they're suitable, you don't know whether people are going to be willing to hire you, right? So there is a process to it. You need to go and apply, you need to go for interviews to see whether you get a job. And that's why people get frictionally unemployed. They spend some time, job hunting. But while it is about imperfect information, one of the biggest determinants of how much frictional unemployment is people's asking salary. Or in economic terms, what we call the reservation wage. And that is the lowest level of salary that you're willing to accept. Now, let's be real. When you're spending a lot of time job hunting, it's normally not because there's no jobs available, but there isn't a job that you feel like you like, or you feel like it has met your salary expectations. By reducing income taxes, you can actually reduce people's asking salary. Because if I reduce income tax, I get to keep a bigger proportion of the income I earn. That could actually make me willing to accept a slightly lower salary from the firm because after taxes, I actually could earn the same amount, right, as if I get paid more and taxes were higher, right? So it could actually reduce frictional unemployment to some extent, all right? Of course, this isn't the best way. So your alternative, right, to relying on this is also supply side policy. Again, it's going to be interventionist policy. And the idea is the government could provide job matching services, right? The government, like in Singapore, right, they set up My Careers Future. It's a job portal for people to job hunt. They have job matching services to help people find jobs. They could have job fairs to help people find jobs, right? So that could also fix frictional unemployment. The limitations are pretty much the same, right, for supply side policies. The limitation for income tax cuts is pretty much the same as those for fiscal policy also. So you can see that the structure of the answer is really quite straightforward, right? It's really fiscal policy pros and cons, supply side policy pros and cons, right? And you got to cover, you realize that across my various points, we covered all the underlying types of unemployment. And that is key. Whenever you're doing a macro policy question, you got to make sure that your mix of policies have covered every single aspect of the problem stated. So if you're doing an inflation question and you only talk about demand pull inflation, you will fail. You do a growth question and you only talk about actual growth, you're going to fail. You got to make sure that you got all your ground covered. And once you understand the structure, it really comes back down to two things. Number one, understanding your pros and cons for your policies. This is where the memorization comes in. You got to memorize how the policies work. You got to memorize their limitations and then practice explaining them. Again, the model essay comes in handy for that. The second thing is you need to understand the factors that affect your macroeconomic goals. And the reason why you need the factors for your macroeconomic goals is you need to combine this with how the policy works in order to explain to the marker how exactly is the problem going to solve, how exactly is the policy going to solve the problem, right? So earlier I made reference to cyclical unemployment and the demand for labor. I made reference to the mismatch of skills. These things must appear in your answer, right? In one form or another. Otherwise, you wouldn't really be addressing the question. Okay? The last thing would be evaluation, right? So what would our evaluation be? So they ask you whether reducing income taxes are the best. So I like to say that evaluations are fundamentally about a dose of reality. Okay? A good way to think about Part B essays in general is that the body of the essay is like analyzing the theoretical possibilities. You're saying that, okay, this policy could be good, but it has these limitations. That policy could be good, but it has limitations. The evaluation is where you amalgamate all those things and go, okay, so like in real life, right? So what is good and what's not so good? And that's why we find ourselves very frequently using the phrase it depends, because in real life, it's not so straightforward. There's no such thing as something that's always good, always effective, or always bad and always ineffective. It's always circumstantial. The phrase it depends really means that our answer is circumstantial. So when I say a dose of reality, I mean it's your job to explain the circumstances under which certain policies are better than others. So tax cuts could be a good policy when the economy is faced with cyclical unemployment. But it will be absolutely useless if the economy were faced with structural unemployment, right? There could be some usefulness for frictional unemployment, but it's not very direct, right? Ultimately, the biggest problem with your income tax reduction is that it might not work. People might not actually lower their asking salary or look for jobs any faster. And it doesn't really address the root cause, right? It does not address the root cause of imperfect information, right? As compared to something like that. This is definitely more direct in terms of solving frictional unemployment, right? So that is to say, frictional unemployment, supply side policy is also better for it. So you will find that in evaluation, sometimes, especially if you look at my essays, they tend to be quite example heavy. And the reason for that is because these answers do not have a simple conclusion, right? There isn't a one sentence answer like, oh, this policy is always the best, or this policy is not always the best. Like, it's always circumstantial. And it's your job to articulate the circumstances under which the policy is good or the policy is not so good. Okay? So that's basically it. That's how you do Part B, right? You need two sides, right? You need a two-sided answer. Pros and cons of policies represents a two-sided answer. You need to have 2 to 3 policies. And lastly, don't forget, you always need an evaluation because evaluation accounts for 5 out of 15 marks. I tell everyone that, it's hard to get a 5, obviously, but it's very, very, very easy to get a 2, right? As long as you write like a decent length, like a quarter page or 1/3 page, and you try to be insightful, you use it depends, you kind of come out with the circumstances under which the policy will be effective, it's very easy to pick up 2 marks. And then you build from there and you improve from there afterwards. All right? I hope you found this useful and I hope to see all of you in class. Take care and see you soon.